I wanted to start the talk tonight by introducing you to a shark that I recently got to know. So it happens to be, it's a male Dusky shark. It was over 3 metres long and it weighed about 300 kilograms. And it was found in the waters near Port Macquarie. So if Port Macquarie just happens to be your favourite holiday destination, there's really no need to worry because Dusky sharks are not known to be dangerous. Secondly, he was found a long way offshore. And thirdly, Port Macquarie is not likely to be his permanent home. So it's most likely that he was just passing on through or just spending a short amount of time in the area. So the other thing I can tell you about this guy is that he was about 18 years of age. And being a Dusky shark, that means that he was a mature adult shark. So thanks to Macquarie University and people like Professor Michael Gillings here, and also thanks to Will Macbeth, who's in the audience right there, from the New South Wales Fisheries Department. I've been lucky enough for the past 2 years to study hundreds and hundreds of sharks, just like this, that we find in the waters off our own coastline. So tonight I'm going to tell you all about the research that I've been doing, and I'm going to tell you how I came to be doing that research, and also, most importantly, why I'm doing it. Okay, there we go, I got it. Okay, so for the purpose of for the benefit of those that don't know, there's currently a commercial fishery that targets large sharks in New South Wales waters. Now, in order to catch these sharks, they use long lines, just like those illustrated here. So a long line simply consists of one main long line, and off that long line there's a series of what they call branch lines, which has a baited hook attached. Now, these long lines are typically weighted to the ocean floor, but sometimes they're suspended just off the seabed. And they're used generally in waters of about 50 to 100 metres, which equates to roughly about 10 to 20 kilometres offshore. So, whether you agree or disagree with the notion of shark fishing in principle, the fact remains that commercial fishing offers a unique and very, very important opportunity to learn a lot about the species that are being targeted. And given the quantities that are being caught, we can learn a great deal over a very short amount of time. So, now using that particular method, the commercial catch of sharks in New South Wales waters had remained steady between 1999 and 2005. Now, between 2005 and 2007, we noticed a dramatic increase in the catch of sharks off our coastline. Now, that was explained largely by the fact that a lot of fishermen started to target sharks. They started to fish specifically for sharks when previously they were not doing that. So an increase in catch like this is particularly concerning from a fisheries management point of view and also from a conservation point of view. Now, the most concerning thing about this at the time was that we actually didn't really have a good idea of what species were actually being caught. So, Will Macbeth at the New South Wales Fisheries Department decided to conduct a huge research project that involved putting scientists on board the commercial fishing fleet in the waters of northern New South Wales. And I was one of those scientists. And we were there to learn as much as we possibly could about what species were being caught and in what proportions. So, without giving too much away of the secrets of these fishermen, because they're very secretive, having been on the boats, I can give you a bit of an idea of what it was like to be on board, and I'll do that by leading you through a day in the life of a shark fishing scientist. Okay, so after getting up at 3 a.m. and fighting off seasickness all day and getting ridiculously sunburnt, for every single shark that was caught, I would record the time of capture. I'd record whether that particular shark was to be retained or whether it was to be released. And I would also note down the condition of the shark at capture, and that is whether the shark was alive or whether it appeared to be dead. Then sharks were hauled on board the boat. I would note down where the shark was hooked, so whether it was hooked in the corner of the mouth, whether it had swallowed the hook, or whether it had been foul hooked in one of its fins, as I'd seen a few times. Then the next step along the way was to actually identify the shark accurately. Now, to the untrained eye, this is actually quite a difficult task, as a lot of these sharks look very, very similar. And when I first started on these boats, I found it very difficult to actually distinguish some of the species apart. But as I became more experienced, I learnt that there's actually 4 simple things to look for. And once you look at those, you can identify these sharks accurately. So the first thing is to look for the presence or absence of what they call an interdorsal ridge. An interdorsal ridge is between the first dorsal fin and the second dorsal fin on the back of the shark. And it looks a little bit like the pleat in a pair of suit pants. So some sharks have an interdorsal ridge, obviously, and some don't. So if you see one, then you can automatically rule out those that don't. The second thing we look for is distinct coloration on the fins of the shark. Then we look at the actual shape of the shark's head in profile. And lastly, we look at the shape of the teeth. Now, the shape of the teeth is probably the most important. Most of you probably didn't know, but sharks, every different species of shark has a different shaped teeth. So if you were to show me a single tooth, I could probably tell you what species of shark that came from. So once we've got the clues from all these 4 things and we have an accurate identification, the next step along the way was to actually physically process each shark. So this happens to be a sandbar shark, and it's a juvenile. It's only about 1 metre long, and this species grows to about 2.5 metres. So in the scheme of things, it's not a big species. It doesn't grow very large, but for the purposes of this talk, this shark represents every shark that was caught and retained by the fishermen. So the first thing I'll do is I take 3 different length measurements. Then I would cut the shark roughly along that dotted line there. And that meant that I could get access to the insides of the shark, and it would also remove the head. So then I needed to determine the sex of each shark and also its degree of sexual maturity. So in the case of a male shark, the male sexual organ is called a clasper, and sharks have 2 claspers. So to determine how sexually mature these sharks are, we need to measure the length of each clasper and note its degree of hardness or calcification. So in the top left there, that's an example of the very small and uncalcified claspers of an immature male shark. And on the right here shows the elongated calcified claspers of a fully mature male shark. Now, in the case of female sharks actually have 2 uteri. So in order to determine their sexual maturity, we need to measure the diameter of each uterus, and note its degree of enlargement. So on the left there is the thin and empty uteri of an immature female shark, and on the right are the greatly enlarged and thickened uteri of a fully mature female shark. Now, once in a while there were unborn pups present in these in the uteri, so we would remove each one and we would determine the sex of each, and we'd take a length measurement. And then finally, we would, from the head region, we would take a section of about 3 to 6 vertebrae, and we'd also take a small flesh sample to be later used for DNA analysis. So, processing each and every shark that was caught like this, you can probably imagine it was a pretty strenuous job on a rocking boat in difficult conditions. But the job was made even more difficult when the weather decided to take a turn for the worse. And here's an example of when that happened on a trip I was on near Port Macquarie. Okay, so after being on these boats for 2 years, what on earth did we learn? So what we learnt is that these fishermen actually catch a very wide range of shark species, but that the majority of these species are actually caught in quite low numbers. So for example, the fishermen catch low numbers of bronze whalers. They also catch short-fin mako sharks and thresher sharks in low numbers. They catch 3 different species of hammerhead sharks. They catch tiger sharks at all different sizes, from large to small. And they also catch black-tip whalers. So those are just a few examples of the species of shark that they catch in low numbers. But the most important thing that we learned was that there are actually 3 species that make up the bulk of the commercial catch. And in this way, these 3 species are the most commercially important, And those three species are what my project is focused on. And those three species are the spinner shark, the dusky shark, and the species that is caught the most frequently is the sandbar shark. So like I said, these three make up the bulk of the commercial catch in New South Wales waters, and because of that, I'm focusing on those for my research. So what I'm trying to achieve is I'm trying to answer a whole suite of questions aimed at gaining biological information. For example, how old do these sharks get? How fast do they grow? I want to know at what size and at what age they start reproducing and at what time of year they're reproducing. I also want to know when do they give birth to their litter of pups and how many pups are in each litter. And the last thing I want to do is I want to work out how many populations of each of these sharks are in New South Wales waters. So, the thing I want to say about that is that we actually don't know the answer to any of those questions for our sharks, for those species of shark in our local waters. And answering these questions is of vital importance because biological information like that forms the basis of effective fishery management. So we need to know the answers to these so that we can manage these species responsibly and try to achieve sustainable fishing. Okay, so in answer to one of them, how old do these sharks get? Well, there's a way that we can work that out. So we actually count growth rings in their vertebrae in exactly the same way that we count growth rings on the trunk of a tree. However, instead of counting the growth rings on the actual face of the vertebrae itself, we take a thin slice through the vertebrae so that these growth rings are easier to see. So to estimate the overall age of a particular shark, we have a vertebrae. We take a very, very thin slice straight down through the middle of it, about 1/2 mil thick, so it's wafer thin. That section looks a little bit like this, and we term that a bow tie section for obvious reasons. Now, if I zoom in on that, if you look closely down the edge that I've put the red dots, you can probably see that there's alternating white bands and dark bands. And the white bands are quite thick and the dark bands are very thin. So it's been shown by scientists all around the world for various species of these shark that the white bands are formed each year around the summertime. So in order to get an estimate of age for each shark, we have their vertebrae, we take a slice, and all we need to do is count the number of white bands on the edge of the vertebrae. So I've actually done that for 255 individual dusky sharks, and these are the results. So don't get too bogged down in it, I'll step you through this very carefully. So each dot here represents the age of an individual shark relative to its size. So down the bottom I have age in years, and on the vertical axis I have total length in centimetres. So the yellow diamonds indicate females, and I have 122 yellow diamond dots on there, and the red circles represent male dusky sharks. So take this point for example, this represents a male dusky shark that I measured to be about 310 centimetres long, or 3.1 metres, and using its vertebrae I estimated that shark to be roughly 15 years old. So now if I add a line that best represents the male growth and a different line that best represents the female growth, the female line being in pink and the blue line representing the male growth, and then remove the dots so we can see it a bit clearer, these two lines can tell us a great deal about how this species grows, and also, more importantly, how the males are growing relative to the females. So straight away, I can tell you that for the first about 18 years of life, the males and females are growing almost identically, and in that time, they're getting to just over 3 metres long. So for the first 18 years of life, the males and females are growing very similarly, and then after that point, they're starting to grow slightly differently. And that is that the females are continuing to grow and the males stop growing. So the result of that is that in this species, females can grow to a larger size than the males. And I also found that the females, even only by a little bit, they have a slightly longer lifespan than the males. Now, I've done exactly the same thing. As I said, I'm dealing with the 3 most commercially important shark species. So I've done it with sandbar sharks, except this time I have almost 450 individual sharks plotted here. So once again, I've put a line, a pink line that best represents the female growth and a blue line that best represents the male growth. So we can see that for about the first 4 years of their life, and in that time they reach about 1.4 metres long, the males and females will grow at a very, very similar rate. But then, like the dusky shark that I just spoke about, the females continue to grow for a longer time than the males, which results in the females attaining a larger size than the males in this species. And the females in the data that I got were shown to have a longer lifespan than the males as well. And the third species, the spinner shark, again, for the first 4 years of life, the males and females are growing almost identically. And in that time, they get to about 1.6 metres long. Once again, the females continue to grow for a longer period of time than the males, which means that they're getting to a much larger size than the males. However, in this species, the information that I received was that the males are able to grow possibly for a little bit longer they have a slightly longer time age span, than the females. So if we put these three species on the same graph, we can look at how they're growing relative to one another. So all I really want to show here is that the red lines are the males and females of the dusky shark, the green is for the spinner sharks, and the blue is for the sandbar shark. So what I found out is that clearly the dusky sharks are the much larger species, and the sandbar sharks the smaller species, and that the dusky sharks have are able to live for much longer than the sandbar sharks. Okay, so I've talked you through all my research to do with the age and growth of these species. Now, the other thing that I want to do is I want to look into how many populations of these species there are in New South Wales waters, and this is of vital importance also to the management of these species. And I can do this by analysing their DNA. So I had DNA samples from almost 300 individual dusky sharks. Almost all of those were collected from New South Wales waters between Tweed Heads and Sydney. And the results look a little bit like this. Now, you saw some results like this in Mike Gillings's talk when he was talking about the mosquito fish invasion from the United States and Europe. And essentially what each one of these pie graphs shows, each colour is an individual genetic signature, if you like. So if you look at Sydney on the bottom here, out of all the sharks that I collected from Sydney, there are only 3 unique genetic signatures there. But what you can see is that one particular genetic signature, which is in the dark blue, that's dominant in that area. And the other thing that you see, if you look at all the locations, is that that same genetic signature is dominant at all the sampling locations. So what this is telling us is that in New South Wales waters at least, there appears to be one single genetic stock of dusky sharks. And that further suggests that potentially these sharks, in order to interact in this way, are travelling great distances along the coast. Now, in terms of the sandbar sharks, I had almost 430 individual DNA samples, almost all of which were collected from northern New South Wales waters. And the results I got were very, very similar. So once again, the blue there, that indicates one genetic signature. And if you look at all the sampling locations on the east coast, the same genetic signature is dominating each location. So once again, the evidence is suggesting there's one genetic stock of this species in New South Wales waters. Once again, that this species is potentially moving great distances along the coast. Then thirdly, for the spinner sharks, I had over 400 DNA samples. However, this time I had samples that were spread over a much wider geographic range. So over half of those were collected from between Sydney and Tweed Heads, and the rest were collected along the Queensland coast from the Northern Territory, and I was also able to get some DNA samples from scientists in South Africa. And the results were very interesting. So there's a lot of different colours in there. There were many different genetic signatures, which shows that this species is very diverse. But what you can see is that this dark blue signature is also dominant at every single sampling location, including South Africa. So I need to go into more depth with this, but the evidence at the moment suggests, like the other species, that at least in New South Wales waters there is one single genetic stock, but that possibly that same stock extends all the way up the east coast of Australia, includes the coast of northern Australia, and is potentially including South African waters, which, as you know, is across the Indian Ocean. So the genetic information is telling us that this species is very diverse and that it's possibly travelling great distances, at least has done before and is possibly still doing now. Okay, so some take-home messages. So if you've learnt nothing from this talk except for these, then I think I've done well. So all you need to know is that there's 3 species of shark that make up the bulk of the commercial shark catch in New South Wales waters. These 3 species grow to different sizes, and they also live to different ages. All 3 species are potentially moving great distances along the east coast of Australia and possibly even further. And biological information like this, there's not a lot of it out there for Australia, but it's, like I said before, it's absolutely critical in being able to manage these species and the fishery responsibly, and to therefore be able to demonstrate that we're fishing these species at a sustainable level. Thank you very much.